Our Bellwether question for today is, what is the function of DNA? Think back to Friday. We found out on Friday that DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. This contains the instructions for how the cells should function, and it's found in the nucleus of the cells. Our fact for today is that human cells are pre-programmed to die through apoptosis. We'll find out what that process is in just a second. Take a look at our cartoon down at the bottom of the slide. I think all of you are probably familiar with the 5-second rule. Well, sorry to burst your bubble, but the 5-second rule is not actually true. Mythbusters did an episode of this in the last couple years, and they found out that as soon as the food item hits the floor, it already has some things that have hitched a ride to your gut if you decide to eat whatever it was that was on the floor. So, moral of the story, don't eat what's been dropped on the floor. So apoptosis is what happens to cells that are damaged or stressed or are just triggered by the body occasionally to go through this process, but the cells do die. And this is one of the reasons we need to have the process of asexual reproduction in order to replace these dead and worn out cells. So we are talking about reproduction being necessary for the continuation of every species. And by the end of class, you'll need to be able to explain the end products of asexual reproduction and list the advantages and disadvantages of asexual reproduction. So here we have some examples of organisms that reproduce asexually. We have strawberries, we have a fungus, we have a hydra, we have a bulb plant, and we have a bacterium. Asexual reproduction is just defined as a form of reproduction in which one organism produces offspring that are genetically identical to the parent. Because there is only one source for this genetic information, you only get offspring that are genetically identical. There is no other parent to offer any traits or genes or chromosomes or DNA into this process. So you're going to get an exact copy. Now, occasionally there are mutations that cause some changes, but usually you're going to get the genetically identical organism each time. Now, you probably know about this fun yellow sponge who lives in a pineapple under the sea. He is very familiar with asexual reproduction. The video clip that we're about to watch involves Sandy Cheeks and SpongeBob and his underwater friends. They are fighting about which is better, land creatures or sea creatures. Let's take a look at what happens.
I bet you can't eat a Krabby Double Deluxe in one bite. Oh.
Give me that. They don't call me Cheeks for nothing.
Thank you.
Well, that's just one thing.
Can you do this? Everyone in my family can do that. How about this?
Can you reproduce by budding? Can ya?
No.
Most importantly,
The battle will continue between the land creatures and the sea creatures, but the point here is that SpongeBob is able to produce little mini versions of himself. Because there is no other sponge involved here, he is reproducing asexually by budding. We'll get into more of that in a minute. So again, asexual reproduction begins with just one organism and finishes with two genetically identical organisms. So you have your parent cell. Everything starts to multiply within the cell. Eventually, there's enough of everything that the cell starts to split apart. The nucleus divides, and the cytoplasm will divide, and all of the organelles will be moved into the new two cells. They will pull apart completely, and you have two new daughter cells. This process is called the cell cycle. This cell division is creating two genetically identical body cells or somatic cells. These are referring to all cells that are not involved in sexual reproduction. So the gametes, which would be the egg cell and the sperm cell, do not go through this process. Those are the only ones that do not go through this process. All the other body cells are called somatic cells, and they go through this process to replace the dead and worn out cells. It is this cell cycle that makes asexual reproduction possible. Some examples of organisms that reproduce this way, we said the strawberry. It sends out a runner. This is also called vegetative propagation. It will send out a runner, and it will have little nodes on there, which will grow, take root, and then you'll have a baby strawberry plant that will grow there. Again, because there is no other genetic information being put into this process, it is a genetic copy of the parent. Bacteria reproduce this way also. Their specific way is called binary fission. The DNA in the parent cell gets copied, the bacteria will split into two new bacteriums, and you will get a genetically identical copy of the parent. The hydra reproduces by budding, just like SpongeBob. This is where we get a growth that is a genetic copy of the parent growing off of the side of the hydra. Once it's mature enough, it will break off and be its own separate, fully functioning organism. Again, genetically identical to the parent. There are some advantages to this type of reproduction. If you only need one parent, you don't have to find a mate. The reproduction tends to be much faster. And because everything is well suited and the organism has survived in order to reproduce, it is going to have all of the helpful traits that it needs to survive in that environment. So this process of asexual reproduction will limit the spread of harmful traits throughout the species, because if it's good for one, it's going to be good for all of them. They're exactly the same. All the organisms are going to be well suited to the environment. So if you look at the lab tables, there are probably bacteria that are happily growing on that lab table. They're well suited to that environment, and they just keep multiplying and multiplying and multiplying. They're just reproducing and reproducing through this asexual reproduction process. Well, let's say we have a Clorox wipe that comes along. It might not be good to all be the same, and we'll talk about that in a second. The process of asexual reproduction provides for what we say is genetic continuity. Everything is genetically the same through the species. Now think back to that Clorox wipe coming through. If all of your organisms are exactly the same, there is no variation in that species. There are no combinations of different traits. Well, if that happens, and you have a Clorox wipe that comes through and it changes the environment, if it kills one of them, it will kill them all. So sometimes having that genetic diversity is actually a good thing, and sometimes it's not needed. So there are some advantages and disadvantages to this asexual reproduction. Also, you do not have any new species created because everything is exactly the same. Now, there are some pretty famous examples of asexual reproduction, and you can kind of think of them as clones. So one of those would be the clone army, of course. Got a lot of Star Wars fans in the class. So we're taking a look at the clone army. They were all clones of, I believe, Boba Fett, and they are supposedly genetically identical to the person who they cloned. Another one you're probably familiar with is Gizmo, because we have been doing those gizmos, meaning those simulations online. But this is Gizmo. He's a Mugwai, and the story is that if you get water on him, he will multiply. Again, there is no other mate. It is just him, and he will create genetic copies of himself.